Hi everyone, Stjepan here. In today's video I'm going to start the series on the Chigorin defense, which is an extremely interesting way to play against the Queen's Gambit. It's offbeat, it's dangerous, it's complicated, most people don't know it, and it's going to lead to positions in which knowing theory is important, being able to calculate well is important, and not being nervous is important. So the Chigorin, the position you can see on the board, is a very interesting opening choice to add to your repertoire, and it could be used as a great surprise weapon. Now, after d4, d5, c4, of course, e6 and c6 are the normal moves, the QGD and the Slav. And knight c6, if you see it on the board, it's either a very good player or a very bad player. And this move makes no sense. If you try to consider the classical principles, this move is simply ugly and bad. However, it's not as simple as that. Now, why would this move be bad? Well, in queen's pawn openings, you never want to block your c-pawn. And if you want to play for equality as black or for an advantage with white, then your c-pawn is going to be a very important factor. For black, it's either going to be used in a Slav fashion to control the center and to reinforce d5, or in the QGD and Tarash and different openings, you can play c5 and break up white's central control. When you play knight c6, you don't have those options. Now, that means three things. Three very important things which are crucial for the Chigorin. Firstly, d5 is going to be weak in many variations, and it's most likely that black is going to capture on c4 to get rid of his weakness. That means that white is often going to be able to build a strong center with e4, d4. That's one thing. The second thing is d4 is weak. In normal Queen's Gambit declined or Slav or semi-Slav positions, d4 is never weak. So once black takes on c4, unlike other openings, let's just give white a stupid move. If you take on c4, usually in normal d4 positions, the principled way to play is to expand with e4, attacking the pawn on c4 and building up a strong center using the fact that black has accepted the gambit and got his d5 pawn away from the center. When in the Chigorin, that simply doesn't work because queen takes d4, and that's it. Black should be winning this position. So that's the second thing. d4 is weak. The third very important thing is that pawn to e5 is an immediate threat. And e5 in many queen's pawn openings is, when black achieves it, it's considered to be a great success. And of course, with a knight on c6, that's going to be much easier to achieve. Okay, so those are the three very important things. In this introductory video, I'm going to give you the basic overview of the opening. I'm going to give you a basic overview of what black can do in this opening and of what white can do to fight this opening. I'm also going to be showing you some interesting traps and attacking ideas. And then I'm going to make a separate video on 4 main variations of the Chigorin. We're going to be talking about 4 main moves, knight c3 being the main line. Then we are going to look at knight f3. We are going to look at pawn takes, pawn on d5, and we are going to look at e3. These are the 4 sensible responses for white, which they are all completely different. When white chooses one of them, he'd better know the positions which arise from that move. And if white is not careful, there are very interesting options for black against each of these. And hopefully after you finish watching the series, and you can find the link to the whole playlist after it has been finished in the link below, in the description below, hopefully you will be able to play this with both sides. I myself play d4, c4 very often, and I'm used to normal stuff. When I see knight c6, I'm not going to say I'm upset, but I'm very close to upset. Even though I know this is an opening the engine doesn't like, that means nothing if I don't know the theory. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to start with the least common move, which is pawn to e3, which could be considered fairly passive. for white, but it has a very simple idea. You're trying to play the normal queen's gambit, open up your pieces, play knight f3, bishop d3, knight c3, develop, and say that d4 is no longer a weakness. Well, we are encountering a problem here. In normal positions, when, for example, there's a pawn on c6, black isn't able to play e5. Here, black is able to play e5, and the position immediately blows up. In the detailed video on this, I'm going to give you my analysis for this move, which took a week, and there are many interesting options which have never been played, or at least I'm not aware, they're not in the database. So basically after e5, again there's pressure on this pawn. Taking on d5 doesn't make much sense, so white takes the pawn. And well, what's the point? If knight takes, then queen takes. Well, the point is d4, and white center is just collapsing. For the moment, if you don't count the pawns, black actually has more pieces out, and that's one of the points of the Chigorin. You want to attack. Your knight on c6 is a great attacking piece. Never mind the strategic and positional consequences of blocking your c-pawn if you manage to checkmate. So this move d4 immediately uses the fact that black is better developed. White already has to take defensive measures, playing a3, blocking, well, the option for bishop b4 check, a5, grabbing space on the queen side, knight f3, putting pressure on this pawn, bishop c5 defending. Now already, again, you can see 2 pieces out. This is dangerous. Okay. E takes d4 is one of the main moves, or the main move. Bishop takes d4, bishop e2, white is trying to castle. Knight g7, the knight develops sensibly, both sides castle. And in this position, after knight c3, black has 2 options. He can take his pawn back, which is not good. Bishop takes e5 is, nah, don't really want to give up your bishop like that. But the interesting option is bishop takes c3. And after b takes c3, this is a ton of fun. I mean, for the moment, black is a pawn down, but that really doesn't mean much. All of these are weak, and there could be trouble. So that's e3. e3 is, well, the least common of the 4 options I'm going to be covering in detailed videos. It's still interesting, and if you like being a pawn up with a ruined pawn structure, then fine, this may be the move for you. But there are other options. What I think is the most interesting option is simply taking this pawn, and this exchange will give white a huge space advantage. Well, it may not be apparent now, but bear with me. Queen takes pawn, forced. Of course, now, if white tries to play the normal tempo move you like to play when there's a queen on d5, knight c3, then again we have a problem because of the c6 knight, queen takes pawn. So white has to defend first, pawn to e3, and it may be hard to imagine these pawns rolling forward, but trust me, it's going to happen in a few moves. Again, black has to play energetically. If black does nothing, then there's no way to break up this center. White is just going to play next knight c3 on the next move and be better. So again, this move e5, which we've prepared with knight c6, knight c3 attacks the queen, bishop b4 pinning. Now there are 2 ways to play. a3 is slightly uncommon. The idea behind a3, forcing the bishop to take, of course, because knight takes queen is forced, is that after takes, you try to play a4, bishop a3. There are ways for black to prevent this, but basically what white is going to do, regardless of whether black manages to prevent it or not, let's say black tries to develop, well, these pawns are going to start rolling forward. And this is a huge space advantage. Now, there are ways to play this with the pawn on e4. There are more common ways to play this with knight e2, knight c3, knight e4, and immediately putting pressure on the position. The second option is bishop to b2. To d2 instead of a3, again forcing the trade. It's possible to take with the bishop or with the pawn. Taking with the pawn is better because you get this pawn storm going again. And now f3, and now all of these are going to start moving forward. And if you look at the position after, for example, this, black has to start breaking this up. Black has to start playing c6 very quickly, or else white with his bishop pair, fine, this bishop is still bad, but it could get out. White with his bishop pair and his huge space advantage is going to have a very pleasant position. So Taking simplifies the position first of all, gets rid of black's attacking chances. It's just no attack. You could lose later on, fine, but you're not getting mated, and gives white space, which is very important. Now the two knight moves, knight f3, knight c3, which are the most common moves in this position, are very interesting too. Knight f3 has the idea of again defending this pawn, and also what e3 doesn't do and knight f3 does. They both defend this pawn, but knight f3 also defends against e5. So this, I think, is very interesting, and I've seen several Ben Feingold games in this position. He plays black and bishop g4. The idea is basically that black is prepared to give up this bishop to increase the pressure on the pawn on d4, and that's not easy to prevent. White has two moves here, knight c3 and cd5. cd5 is, I would say, the principled way to play. And now black exchanges, g takes, excuse me, queen takes. And what do we have in this position? Well, after e3 and e5, black again plays this energetic move. It's obvious that white has the bishop pair, black has a much better pawn structure, and believe it or not, black has a much safer king. White should be better if he plays correctly. However, it's not clear where the white king is going. If you go to the king side, well, that seems risky. If you go to the queen side, it's already blown open. Whereas the black king could castle either way. Castling queenside is a perfectly sensible move, increasing the pressure on the queen. And this is going to resemble, this may sound strange, but Najdorf positions with colors reversed, in which the pawn structure is slightly different. It's not d6, e5, it's e3, d4. However, the king is going to be stuck in the center for most of the game, and good attacking chances for black. That being said, white has the bishop pair and great central control, so that equalizes matters. And finally, the main move, knight c3, which I think Chigorin players are very happy about. This is the principled way for white to play, but it also allows the idea behind the Chigorin. You can just take this pawn, so just take d takes c4. And now there are two ways to play. You can play d5. We will cover all of that in great detail, but the best way to go about this is to play knight f3, preparing the move e4. Of course, playing e4 immediately hangs the d4 pawn. We saw that. So you can either play d5 or knight f3. Now knight f6, e4, fine, white is expanding, but there are two problems. The first problem is white still has to regain his pawn. So you still have to take on c4 to achieve material balance. The second problem is black's pieces are going to look perfect. Why? Because black gets to pin both knights. So firstly, bishop g4. Again, pressure on d4. You have to neutralize that. If for example, bishop e2, then bishop takes, queen d4. So bishop to e3 defending. And now e6, opening up your other bishop. White gets his pawn back, fine. Bishop b4. Now look at these pieces. I mean, fine, you're not controlling d5. You're not defending d5. You are unable to play c5. But your knight on c6 exerts a tremendous amount of pressure. Again, with the move bishop b4, we have a threat. If white castles, for example, then bishop c3, bc3, knight e4, pawn up, thank you very much, I win. So again, white has to play a concession. So queen d3 and queen c2 are the two common moves. After queen c2, everything is finally defended. Black gets to castle, and if we look at this position, well, what do we see? Black's pieces are perfectly active, very fine. White has a huge center, but there are ideas of e5. The center can be broken up. Maybe this knight moves, maybe the c-pawn moves later on. So these are very, very interesting positions. So all four moves lead to different interesting positions in which both sides will have chances. Black, to be honest, doesn't have to know a million moves of theory. It's important to know the plans against each. I would say the most important thing is to know when to break with e5, what to do against d5 when this pawn advances, when can you take on c4, where do you put your pieces, where does your king go. Looking at, for example, Alexander Morozevich's games or Richard Rapport's games or Ben Feingold games is going to give you a great idea of how they win. So basically they win because their opponents don't know what to do. Let me give you a quick example of what can happen in this opening. So for example, we play the move knight c3 as white, black plays knight f6. Fine. You can take on the next turn, it doesn't really matter, it's going to transpose. e4, bishop g4, we saw this, bishop e3 defending, e6, fine. Bishop takes c4, bishop to b4. And now, if this move queen d3 is played, which is playable, it's the second most common move instead of queen c2, slightly more active, then, for example, black plays bishop h5, and this may not seem like much. White hasn't castled yet, so we don't really want to take on f3, but there's a very sneaky idea of simply taking the pawn on e4. So if white goes wrong with, for example, a3 or rook d1 or rook c1, so a3, for example, we take, b takes, and bishop g6, and now there's simply no way to defend the pawn. You could play bishop g5 or knight d2. After knight d2, this is completely winning for black, because you simply take knight e4, and queen h4. And that's it. There's no way to defend the knight. f3 is pinned, of course, so, for example, castles, queen e4, pawn up, again, thank you very much. If, for example, bishop g5 is played to pin the knight, then again you can just take bishop e4, bishop f6, bishop takes queen, bishop takes queen, bishop c4, bishop c7, and white is not castling. This bishop is going to be used to gain a tempo. White's pawn structure is much worse than black's. So that's one example. Let's see what white can do. So for example, if knight c3 is played, and d takes c4 is played, and knight f3 is played, well, we know that knight f6 is the principled move. We saw that. But what if black tries to play bishop g4 straight away, just trying to take on f3 and take on d4? Well, actually, white just wins now. Okay, here's how white wins. d5, gain a tempo on the knight. Of course, the knight now does not have the e5 square. All other squares are pretty bad, so exchanging here ef3 to get the e5 square. Now just chase the knight away. Bishop to f4. Knight to g6, and now here's the beautiful part. You can simply take the pawn on c4. There's too much pressure on the king. If black takes this bishop, which loses straight away, then you win the game. If black doesn't take this bishop, then you're a pawn up. I'm sorry, you got your pawn and you have a beautiful position. The engine gives this as +2.5. So let's say black takes the bishop. We now play bishop b5, check, c6, dc6. Fine, queen exchange is okay, and now you're getting mated. If you don't play f6, you just get mated. So f6, and I take your rook. So these are the kind of things that could happen in the Chigorin, and it's tricky for both sides. There are many traps. I'm going to be showing you a ton of traps throughout the series in the 4 detailed videos. I hope you liked the intro video. I'm going to continue with knight to f3, which I think is a very interesting option. And yeah, we're going to get deep into theory so that all Queen's Gambit players are prepared for the Chigorin. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye! Hi everyone, Stjepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the Chigorin series with the move pawn to e3, which is the rarest of the 4 normal moves against the Chigorin, and it shouldn't give white much. But still, if black doesn't know what he's doing, he could end up a pawn down in a difficult position. So it's important to know the theory. If you can hear scratching, my dog is scratching her bed, so I'm sorry. So let's get into the opening. So d4, d5, c4, knight c6. So far we've been looking at knight f3. If you haven't seen that video, please do. Also, if you haven't seen the introductory video, look at that so that you can understand the basics of the opening. So with the move knight c6, black is doing a couple of things. He is putting pressure on d4, which is very important. He is relinquishing his ability to defend the center with the c-pawn, which is very counterintuitive in all d4 openings and could end up being troublesome. So the Chigorin is, because of that, considered a slightly unsound opening and a slightly uncommon opening, but there's a lot of things going on, so not being able to defend the center is not going to be that big of a deal if you know what to do. And the third and final thing what the Chigorin prepares is the move e5. So if white does nothing, then pawn to e5. Also, if black manages to take on c4, unlike other d4 openings, white is not going to be able to expand freely with e4 because there's a queen on d4 and there's a knight on d4. So white has to be careful. In the last video we looked at knight f3, which prevents e5 and defends d4. Today we are looking at pawn to e3, which is the fourth most common move, simply defending d4 but not preventing e5, and that's a problem. So in this position, black's only sensible move is e5. He could play e6 or knight f6. I'm not going to get into that too much. Those moves are going to lead to positions which are just slightly better for white. So for example, something like this, you actually don't have enough for the fact that your knight is on c6. You would like to have a normal semi-Slav with the knight on d7 and the pawn on c6, or you would like to be able to play c5. So yeah, this isn't as active. If you play the Chigorin in this position, you have to play e5, and this is the critical position. Now, white has three options. One of them is the key option that keeps us in the e3 lines, and that's what we are going to be exploring, and that's of course the move d takes e5, simply grabbing the pawn. The two moves I would like to mention is c takes d5, and this we are going to cover in the next video. This is going to transpose to the exchange variation, where on move 3 white takes, and you're going to see how. So in this position, after e3, e5, c takes d5, we get the position queen takes d5, knight c3, bishop to b4, bishop to d2, bishop c3, bc3, and we are transposing to the exchange, and that's, as I said, going to be covered. Nevertheless, players with black have to know it, but it's not the topic of this video. And another option is knight to f3, which is a very interesting move, which firstly could tempt this center forward, which would not be smart. If you play e5, then knight d2, and white should be very good here. This center is going to collapse. Also, if you play e4, excuse me. Also, this is going to transpose to the English opening most often, and here is how. Black should play ed4 here, that's the best move. ed4, and now knight f6, knight c3, bishop to e7. This is starting to look normal. cd5, knight d5, and bishop to d3. And after both sides castle, we are now in the king's English 4 knights. Let me show you how we can reach that position. So c4, e5, excuse me, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, the 4 knights English. White plays e3, black plays bishop e7, white plays d4, ed4, ed4, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop to d3. This has been played a ton of times. Dingliren plays this, many strong players play this. So in this position, if knight f3 is played, it's most likely that if two good players are playing, we are going to get an English opening. However, the main move is not cd or knight f3, it's d takes e5, and this is the critical way to try and punish what black is doing. And black has only one move to compensate for this, and that's d4. Okay, after d4, there are three interesting options for white. One of them is the main line, the critical line. We are going to be focusing on that, and that's pawn to a3. There are two alternatives which are not as good for white. However, in all cases, white temporarily wins a pawn, and black has to make up for that or win the pawn back. So either black wins the pawn and the position is equal, or black doesn't win the pawn, excuse me, and he plays for a ton of activity. So a3 we are going to cover last. So e takes d4. This is a very interesting option, because white has already grabbed one pawn. You can see that black is temporarily 2 pawns down. Now, this is not a particularly good move. It's not bad, but it should make the position equal. However, if black doesn't know how to regain his pawn, then he could be in trouble. So let's take the first one. This is simple. Queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, threatening knight c2. So bishop to d3 is forced. If you play knight a3, I take it and take your rook. So bishop to d3. Now, increase the activity. Bishop to g4. This simply prevents the knight from developing easily, because if you play knight e2, I can take, force your king to take. Okay, h3, chasing the bishop away, bishop to h5, and now bishop to e3, attacking the knight. And again, black is a pawn down, has to keep the activity going, so castles queenside. Okay, knight to d2, normal move. Knight e7, normal move. It's possible to play bishop b4, but I believe knight e7 is better because you're simply threatening knight to c6. So at this point, white needs to give up his bishop pair, so bishop d4. Rook d4, because if black manages knight c6, then he takes with the knight and gets very tricky. Bishop to e2, defending the bishop, it was attacked. Black does not want to trade, so bishop to g6. Bishop f3, very good diagonal, but now bishop f5, and the idea is to simply transfer the bishop here to the best possible square, and then eventually play for knight c6, force white to trade this bishop off, or simply wait and play knight to g6 and attack the pawn if you don't want to double your c pawns. So knight e2, for example, the rook goes back, bishop to e4. Now this trade is smart by white, but after this happens, now black either wins the pawn back or white has to play f4. And after f4 there's a trick. And I would say, I mean, this has never been played. We are about 5 moves out of theory, but stuff like this I think you should be at least familiar with. I've spent a long time during the last 10 days studying the Chigorin because I was not prepared for recording this some videos in this series, and this is one of the lines that I've been exploring. And in this position, black can actually take on f4, and after knight takes f4, you have rook to d4. After castles takes, this should be equal, but if I had to choose, I would choose black, to be honest, because everything is sort of loose, and you can take on c4. He takes here. Here you can play g6, and this pawn is going to end up being a target. And with pawns on both sides of the board, and with this isolated king's pawn, I think black should hold a slight edge. So again, after d4, let's just get into the opening. So e3, e5 takes, d4. If white just takes, you can trade once, forcing bishop d3, increase the pressure with g4, h3 should really be played, bishop to e3, castle queenside. This is very important. This you have to play. So castle's queenside. Knight d2, knight e7, bishop takes, rook takes, and fine, you are a pawn down. But as you can see, you're not going to be a pawn down forever. And your king is better, your pieces are better, you have the 2 bishops, your rook is on d4. What more could you ask for? So I'm going to say that after d4, white should not be taking this pawn, because if black is prepared, black is going to have a very pleasant position after he regains the pawn, or if he by some chance doesn't, he's still fine. Excuse me. The alternative to this is knight f3, and knight f3, again, not the most active move. Bishop to b4 check, bishop to d2, and now you can simply take on e3. And of course, white will have to take with the pawn, and now you play bishop to g4. And again, white is a pawn up, but in this position it's even clearer that this pawn means absolutely nothing, because after, for example, knight c3, you can take on e5. And so let's have a look at that. Knight c3, knight e5, queen a4 check, the knight drops back. Knight e5, for example, you can just drop back to d7. And the material is equal here, but black has a much better pawn structure, and I want to be black. So actually, after d4, white really should be playing the main line with a3. So let's have a look at that. So once again, d4, d5, c4, knight c6, e3, e5, d5, d4, a3, the critical line. There are a couple of ways for black to play. I'm going to recommend the most active move, which again may seem rather counterintuitive, but black should not be going for his pawn straight away. He should not be aiming to recapture this pawn straight away. So the main move is a5, simply preventing a queenside expansion, and that's a very good move. There are two more moves. There's knight g7, which makes sense. Again, it's going to lead to positions where e d4 should be okay. Again, with queen d, knight d. And there's d takes e3. And d takes e3 is interesting, but I don't think it's in the spirit of the Chigorin. So let's have a look at that. D takes e3. White now really should trade queens, because otherwise black is going to trade queens. So queen takes, king takes, bishop takes. You grab your pawn back. No one is better here. I mean, black has lost castling rights. Unlike the Berlin, white still has the bishop pair, so white could play knight f3 here, slightly ruin his pawn structure, but he doesn't have to. Maybe knight c3 is better, and bishop e6 attacking this one. Castles queenside, king c8. Maybe now you can continue with stuff like knight d5. I mean, this should be slightly more pleasant for white. So d takes e3, even though tempting, just getting your pawn back straight away, I don't think is a good move. Knight g7 is more interesting, but after knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, and again taking, even though now you can take the queen with your rook, this should still not be too good, because after bishop f3, knight e5, you got your pawn back, but then bishop b7, you can take on c4, but then bishop a7, and white is actually a very dangerous pawn up in this position. And if you take on b2, then you are simply worse, because the a pawn is marching down the board and you are completely unprotected. Also, rook d1 is really not scary, I think. So there's a trick here which I found. You can play knight a5, and after the bishop retreats, you can actually go for a draw like this. So if you want to bail out, this is interesting. Other than that, I don't think knight g7 is the way to go. I think you need to play for activity if you play this line, and e3 is an attempt by white to make the position very slow and very calm, and you should not allow him to do that. And the move like knight g7 would do that for white. So we play a5. Now, of course, white has to know all of these lines. He has to know knight g7 and d takes e3. So I'm going to say that white is going to have more work here, but if e3 is the only thing he does against the Chigorin, then that's not too much time to invest. After a5, we are preventing b4 and sometimes threatening a4. White continues knight f3, and now bishop to c5. Again, it's possible to take, but we don't want to take. We want to develop our pieces rapidly. We want to play bishop c5. Now you can see why a5 was useful, and we are now putting pressure. Now, if white does nothing, then we do take and ruin the pawn structure, get our pawn back, play bishop g4, and take the pawn on e5. So e d4 in this position. Bishop takes d4. Bishop to e2 is the main move. It's possible to take, but in that case, I believe black is fine, so white should really get his king to safety quickly. So both sides castle here. Knight c3. And this, you could say, is an important point in the game. There was only one high-rated game from this position. Bareev-Morozevich and Evgeny Bareev won with the white pieces. So you can have a look at that game. The critical move is bishop takes. And after pawn takes, you now play knight g6 and get your pawn back. So it's going to be a position in which, after, for example, queen e7 and rook e1, you're going to have equal material with a better pawn structure, but it's going to be hard to develop this guy. And if you play something like b6, then c5 is coming, and the position could get quite tricky with white's bishop pair. So, for example, knight c5, knight e5, knight e5, bishop d3. Here you don't lose a piece, you can play a move like rook d8. But you can see that these two bishops seem very annoying. And if I had to choose, I would rather be white. The engine gives this as almost equal. And of course, you have a better pawn structure. So if you can trade pieces of, get into a major piece endgame, you will have more targets. If you can trade everything off and get into a king and pawn endgame, you should be winning. Even a knight versus bishop endgame should be winning for black, I think, depending on where the kings are. So let's go back. a5 is a very useful move, preparing bishop c5. Again, white should not really be taking on d4. We saw lines like that, but with a5 thrown in, it should be slightly better than the other lines. So white continues knight f3, and bishop c5, and ed, and bishop d. Again, this, or excuse me, this, yeah, I don't think should be that scary. Again, this is the position we saw already. Here I could actually play knight to b3 because a3 has been played and this doesn't work, so you actually drop a piece. So bishop e2, knight g7, castles, castles, knight c3, and now we take, and we play knight g6. We are going to get our pawn back. We are going to have a knight and bishop versus the bishop pair, so that's slightly worse, but you have a lot of play. So I think, considering that e3 is an attempt to calm the position down, this is what you get with black, that's fine. And this is probably the best white can do. So to conclude, in this position, in the Chigorin, I don't think white should play e3. It's a move black has to know how to defend against, but knight f3, knight c3, and the exchange are definitely more active for white and trying to punish the Chigorin. e3 does not try to punish the Chigorin because it allows e5. Okay, next video we are going to continue with the exchange, and after that we are going to have a look at the main line with knight c3. Thank you for watching, let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye! Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the Chigorin series with the move knight f3 for white, which in my opinion is, well, either the trickiest or the second trickiest move for black to face. And it makes a ton of sense to develop this knight. I'm going to show you why. So if you haven't seen the introductory video to the Chigorin, please do. I've tried to explain the basic ideas of the opening there. I'm not going to spend too much time on that here. But basically the idea behind knight c6 is put pressure on d4, prepare e5, and give up the option to support your d5 pawn with the pawn on c6, and also giving up the option to play c5 later on, breaking the center. So that's very risky. And the move knight f3, which we are looking at today, makes perfect sense because it does two things out of everything I've mentioned. Defends d4, prevents e5, and it's a normal developing move. White is preparing to castle king side, play e3 and develop. So if black does nothing, it's going to be a very clean position for white, in which he is basically going to have an advantage because black is playing without the c-pawn, and that's a big disadvantage in all queen's pawn openings. So black only has one idea here, and this is what makes it easier for black to learn than most other moves we are going to look at. But even if black knows what he's doing, the resulting positions are easier for white to play if white knows the theory and if white knows the plans. So what black should do here is play bishop g4. Now, if you know the Roy Lopez, let's look at this as a Roy Lopez in reverse, where we are fighting for the e5 square instead of the d4 square. Black is trying to simply eliminate this knight, get some pressure on e5 and get some pressure on d4. So that's a very sensible option. And white is going to have two ways to play this position. Either exchanging on d5 straight away, or playing the move knight c3, reinforcing his position. They're going to be very different. Before we look into that, I just want to show you one alternative for black, which is playable, but it's not good. Nevertheless, players with white have to know what to do against it, so I'm going to show it to you. And if you play the Chigorin with black, this may be an interesting way to spice things up. However, you could get punished. And that's playing e5 straight away. Now, e5 is simply not a good move, and here's why. White could take with the d-pawn, but that's not as good. After d takes, then bishop b4 check, and bishop to d2, and d takes c4, for example, e3, bishop e6. This is okay for black. This is not bad. And obviously both sides have 7 pawns, pieces are going to get traded off, both of these are weak, so not that big of an advantage for white, although white should be slightly better. The way to punish e5 is to take with the knight. And now if black does nothing, white is simply going to take on c6 and be very happy with this position. So black takes knight e5. And after d5, black only has one way to stay in the game, basically, and that's to play the move d4. If you don't play d4, then you have to take. White is going to trade queens, play e4, and have a very pleasant position. So you play the move d4, and now white has 2 ways to keep his extra pawn. He can play e4, which is risky, again allowing en passant, which isn't good. After e4, knight e7 should be played. But the principled way to play is pawn to g3. And now white is a clean pawn up. You don't have a knight on c6 to put pressure on e5. What's more important, you don't have the normal developing move knight f6. So black's best, according to the engine, is c5 and then bishop g2. Look at this bishop. Knight e7, trying to get to c6, and then f4, simply defending the pawn. This is just very good for white. I mean, it's a clean extra pawn. Fine, you have weakened some squares, and it's not clear where this bishop is going. But later on, you have the moves like b4. You can completely destroy black's central position. Also, you have the move e3. So e5 is simply not a good move. You take with the knight, and you have a good position. Let's look at bishop to g4. Now the two options are cd and knight c3. Let's start with c takes d5. After bishop to g4, c takes d5 is, well, a way to eliminate black's play in the center and sort of make this knight look silly. However, black can get some initiative going, and black is going to get a better pawn structure in exchange for white having a strong center and the 2 bishops. Now let's see how that happens. So basically, if you take on d5, that's not good. That's just a bad move. Knight c3, the queen has to move. White is going to play e4, perfect position. So after cd5, you have to take this knight. Here, white has one very good option and 2 alternatives which are not as good. The main idea is to take with the g-pawn, reinforcing your center. Let's just briefly have a look at dc6. This is playable. It's fine for white, but it's risky. After knight c3, e6, black gets fairly natural development in comparison to positions with the knight on c6. Bishop b4 pinning the knight, pawn to f3, this pawn was attacked. And now queen h4 check, provoking g3, the queen drops back to f6, bishop e3, and black castles queenside. If you want to go in for this, then you have to be well prepared. Obviously, white is not any material up. White does not have the bishop pair, which he does in the line where you take gf3. And white has a lot more space, and that's a good thing. However, either side could win this. This is just very messy and very risky. The other way to play this position is, if you don't take here and if you don't play the main move, is to take with this pawn, but this is simply better for black. And here is why. You can take on d5, and now of course, since the f3 knight has been eliminated, knight c3, the normal tempo move, doesn't work. So when you play bishop e3 defending, then black breaks with e5, and after knight c3 you are in time to play bishop b4, and basically white is just going to collapse here. Black has a better pawn structure in exchange for nothing. White doesn't have anything here. The bishop pair, fine, you have the bishop pair, but black should be better here. So after bishop takes f3, you take with the g-pawn. This is the position. So let's go from the start. Knight f3, bishop g4. If white takes on d5, play bishop takes f3. White has to take with the g-pawn if he wants to achieve a pleasant position. And now you take your pawn back, queen takes d5. And the idea is that if knight c3, this knight has been eliminated, you can take on d5, on d4, excuse me, so e3, defending. And now, since knight c3 has been threatened, you either have to play e6 or e5. e6 is playable. It's not a bad move, but e5 is more active, because you put a pawn in the center, you threaten to win the pawn on d4, and white is forced to react. So e5. And knight c3, of course, attacking the queen, bishop to b4. One advantage of playing e6 over e5 is that after knight c3, you can move your queen instead of pinning, so you have the option to play queen h5, which is interesting for f3, but still e5 is more pleasant. Knight c3, bishop b4, and this is sort of the starting position. After bishop d2, you take because your queen was attacked, b takes c3, and the queen drops back away from the tempi, queen to d6. And if you look at this position, and this is what you're going to get if dc is played. Let's see which side has what in this position. Well, white has the bishop pair, black has the two knights. The center is closed for the moment, but this should still favor the bishops heavily, because as soon as the pawns start moving forward, it's going to be near impossible to keep everything closed. And also the bishops have very natural diagonals, even if the structure remains like this. The knights, on the other hand, don't have that many useful squares. And that is a problem. I mean, no good knight jumps are possible. So this is in favor of the bishops. The second thing we have to point out is that the white king is never castling. If it does, then it's going to be king side, and this bishop is going to be able to cover the king. And the only time you do castle king side is when black has already castled king side. Otherwise, I think it's too committal and too risky. So you have to wait for black to commit, then you can think about castling. The other thing that's, well, provided by the fact that white cannot castle, by the fact that these two files are open, is that white can play rook b1 and rook g1, which is very useful. So white has very active rooks and better bishops. What white also has is an extremely strong central pawn majority, which gives a good shelter to the king. It's also extremely mobile, so this could go in a ton of different directions, depending on what white does with his pawns and what white does with his bishops. White usually starts with rook b1 here. Why not? Just putting pressure on the pawn. And now black has a few options. None of them are too pleasant, I'm going to say. So you can castle queenside, you can play rook b8, or you can play b6. No other way to defend the pawn. So first let's have a look at rook b8. This has been played a few times, but after f4, simply destroying the last force black has in the center, ef4, e4, this is scary. And rook g1 is coming. The center is now very strong. This pawn is weak. If you play g5, then where's your king going? So rook b8 is considered passive and bad. The main alternative is castles queenside, but now queen b3. Again, this is scary, so you have to play b6 anyway. And now queen takes f7. This pawn is not too important, because black is going to play a crazy game and try to mate. After rook b8, something like queen c4 just dropping back. I think white's position is just better. Queen f6 attacking this pawn, but bishop e2, knight g7, and fine, black will have a lot of play, and there's a great chance for white to go wrong. But if white plays principled moves, then probably black is just losing. I mean, this is a pawn up and the bishop pair in exchange for having a king in the center. But if we compare the two kings, I'd actually say white's king is safer. So most people in this position play b6 without committing their king yet. White continues with f4 anyway. We have this e takes f and e4. The mobile pawn center, knight g7, queen to f3, preparing to take this pawn. And black's main move here is to castle kingside. It's scary, but it's playable. As in all Chigorin lines, the engine thinks white is better, a lot better. But this is not that easy to convert. So in this position, the material is equal. Black's king is relatively safe. Nothing major is going on yet. Black is threatening to take this pawn. If you make a mistake with a move like bishop d3, then I take here with check. Then again, you have to develop your bishop to try to either get your king to f1 or to castle. So for example, bishop e2, knight g6, tempo on the bishop, and also defending along this diagonal, this file. And something like bishop c1, queen takes a2, rook takes b2, maybe queen a3. And now black has won a pawn, but again, I would rather be white because now there are h4, h5 ideas. And with this bishop pair pointing towards the king, with this rook, well, even being able to come up to b5 and switch here, and with this rook coming to g1, practically speaking, black is in trouble. However, you have a passed a pawn, so that's something you could look forward to. If you manage to trade off pieces, you're definitely better. So after bishop e2, there's one alternative which seems nice, and that's pawn to f5. And now you're threatening to open up white's position. And if I'm playing black, I would play f5 here. This has been played, for example, by Vasily Smyslov in the final of the candidates in '84. Kasparov drew this game against him. So this is not trivial for white to play against. And with the move f5, you basically get counterplay. Since then, f5 has only been played once. Against 2400 player won against the 2200 player, and the 2400 player played f5. So this leads to fun positions in which white's best is to simply castle. You take this pawn, bishop takes on c7, f takes e4, queen takes e4, and something like queen d5. And if a queen trade happens, then white has a lot of pressure, and this could be immediate trouble. But black can try to avoid that. So after castles, you can try to complicate things. There are many options here. For example, f takes e4 has been played by Vasily Smyslov, and after queen takes e4, he simply took on c3. And bishop e3 was played by Kasparov, and the game was eventually drawn. The reason why I don't like this queen trade with queen d5 check knight d5 is bishop c4, this annoying pin. And if you try rook f5, then rook b5, and then if you try knight e7, then of course bishop d6 is annoying. And there are ways to get out of this mess, but even if you do, you'll spend a ton of time and white will still be better. So for example, bishop e3, rook c3, bishop e7, rook b3, knight e7. This is probably the best black can get. It's an exchange for a pawn, so black should be lost, but maybe he can hold. So after f5, even though the position is interesting, you're going to have to be careful, and you may find yourself in a bad position. That being said, it's still better than knight g6 in my opinion, because it doesn't allow the easy h4, h5. But coming back to the starting position, this you're going to get in most of your games. Still the best you can get. Okay, so the move c takes d5 is very interesting for white. I've looked at several games by Ben Feingold in this position. It has also been played by Grishchuk, Nakamura, Dengliren, many interesting games. White scores about 40%, so that's good enough on the highest levels. The alternative after bishop g4 is to play knight c3. And here black has to be very careful. If black plays normal moves, seemingly normal moves for this position, like trying to win a pawn, then white is simply winning. So this doesn't work. If you play dc4, then d5, and you have two options. I showed you one in the intro video, one trap, and that's if bishop f3, then e takes f3. Of course, the idea behind bishop f3 is to vacate the e5 square for the knight. Then ef3, knight e5, and bishop f4, and that's it. That's just over. Knight g6, bishop takes c4. If you take on f4, you lose immediately to bishop b5, and of course you have to play c6. D takes queen trade, and eventually you lose a rook with cb check. And after bishop takes c4, even if you play a normal move, believe it or not, the engine gives this as +4 for white. The reason is fairly simple. You're never developing these two pieces. e6 is obviously too risky. e5 is obviously too risky. Moving this knight, I mean, for example, something like this, and castles. White is perfectly developed. Black is never getting his king out of the center. Completely winning for white. If you don't believe me, turn on the engine. And the alternative, which is even worse, after d5, playing knight a5, simply loses to queen a4. You have c6 for the moment, defending the knight and blocking the check, but after b4, you simply resign. If you take en passant, then queen takes bishop. And if you play b5, for example, well then, queen takes knight. So you have to be very careful. After knight c3, normal moves don't work. And what's really nice about this for white is that black is going to be forced to play a calmer position than he usually does, especially after cd5, which is much more complicated than this and more tactical. And black has to play the move e6. This prevents d5. Now we are threatening dc, we are also threatening bishop f3. I should also mention that in this position, playing bishop f3 also doesn't work, because g f3, and if you take dc4 now, then again d5. And we know what's happening after knight e5, then bishop f4, and after knight a5, then again queen a4 check, c6 and b4. We've seen this position before. So e6. And now white has several ways to play. White can play bishop f4 or bishop g5, which are not considered as critical. Against bishop f4 you can take on f3, and against bishop g5 you simply offer a trade of dark squared bishops. White can also play the move e3, which is even more passive than you just develop with knight f6. So the critical way to play is to take on d5. Of course, black has to recapture this, and now play bishop f4. In this position, this bishop isn't really useful, and white is controlling e5 too many times. So there are two ways to play. You can either take the bishop, which is the main move, or you can play bishop d6. Now, one thing I should mention, this bishop d6 idea is going to be very common for these lines. If both sides know what they're doing, bishop d6 is going to be on the board. One thing you shouldn't be scared of is losing this pawn. This pattern you have to reinforce in your mind, because if you don't know it, then you're not going to play bishop d6, which is the best move. If knight takes, then you take, and after, bishop f3, for example, and g f3, then queen d4, and black is equal. Castles queenside, you can play rook d8, you can castle queenside. Black is equal. Probably the bishop is much stronger than the knight. However, black's pawn structure is prettier, and who knows, this should be equal. So after bishop to d6 straight away, white should play bishop to g3 and not take here. And now we play knight g to e7 defending. So that's a slightly more passive way to play. A more direct way to play after bishop f4 is to take on f3 first, and after g takes f3, now play bishop d6, because you are ruining his pawn structure and your bishop wasn't that useful anyway. So again, the same thing applies. If knight d5, then bishop f4 here, and now same position. So we saw this already, queen d4, knight d4, castles queenside, and for example rook d8 or castles queenside is both fine. Position could go something like this. Taking with the king is probably more active, so something like this, and rook g1 and g6, and bishop versus knight. Neither pawn structure is too pretty. The bishop should be slightly better, but black should hold. So again, after bishop d6, bishop g3 should be played. And now knight g to e7, again defending the pawn. We saw this already as well. Pawn to e3. And now black is not much worse. The bishop pair is an advantage, but double f pawns are a disadvantage. So black has a lot to play for. And there are a couple of plans here. You can castle kingside, play a normal position. You can play queen d7 and try castling queenside, which is also fair. You can play a6, preventing bishop b5 or knight b5. You can play f5, threatening f4, which is very interesting. So there are a lot of ways to play this position. I like h5 the most because it forces white to do something. And the main move here is actually a3. And after h4 you trade the bishops. And I think this trade is very favorable for black. Playing h3 or h4 by white would leave too many weaknesses, so this is the best he can get. And after something like bishop h3, pawn to f5, pawn to f4, this is a very common setup. And I think this is the best black would go for. And since the center is closed, and since you have these very nice pawns on the light squares, then of course this bishop is not as strong. It could reroute, but that would take a lot of time. And black often has ideas like rook h6, rook g6, or rook d6, rook g6. Doubling up the pressure here is very hard to do, but it's possible if the bishop goes away. This pawn can often be a weakness, and if the rook moves, you often have g5 ideas. So for example, something like rook g1, rook g8, maybe queen c2, putting pressure on the pawn. I don't know, king b8, castles queenside, maybe g6, and king b1. This should be fine. And of course now, as black, you have to think, how can I get my knights into play? Obviously, even getting a knight into e4 could provoke f3, and that's the best you can get. But that's also nice, because if you provoke f3, then all of a sudden rook e8, rook h7, rook e7, and pressure on e3. So there are things to play for here. And getting the knight into e4 is not that hard. You can play rook g7, knight g8, knight f6, knight e4. So there are ways to play this position. Also, you could set up some pins with, for example, rook g7, knight g8, knight h6. Rook g7, knight g8, knight f6, knight h5, and then trying to take here, if you manage to double the rooks. So there are interesting possibilities. Again, white is not without chances, and practically speaking, this should again be equal. White has, for example, knight a4, knight c5, which is scary. Black would do the same thing. Since a3 has been inserted in this particular position, this plan should be better for black than for white, because g3 is dangerous. But yeah, both sides have chances, and probably there's going to be some battle on the semi-open c file. There's definitely going to be battles on the g file. So a complicated position. So again, after knight f3, bishop g4, knight c3, black needs to be careful not to do anything too risky. Play e6, play a normal move, accept a more quiet position. cd, ed, bishop f4, best square for the bishop. I think the best is to take and then play bishop to d6. This pawn should not be taken, again, leads to an equal position. So bishop to g3, knight g7, and you play. This is fine for black. I would say that if you play the Chigorin after bishop g4, you are definitely more afraid of cd than you are of knight c3, if you know about all the tricks and traps after knight c3. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you got something from the video. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments below. I hope I can answer. And yeah, stay tuned for more chess. We are going to continue the Chigorin soon. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video, I'm going to continue the series on the Chigorin defense with what I believe is the simplest way for white to play, which is why I'm going to cover this from white's perspective. It's going to be an exception in the series. And I'm also covering it from white's perspective because I believe that's the way for white to play. Nevertheless, I'm going to give you plans and ideas for both sides and also recommend what both sides should do. So let's get into the opening. d4, d5, c4, the queen's gambit, and knight to c6, the Chigorin. So far, we looked at, well, different options, more aggressive than what we are looking at today. And today we are looking at this exchange, which does two things. if we look at the Chigorin, black has two ideas. The first one is sometimes take the pawn on c4 because you don't have an easy refutation to this. For example, if white does nothing, then takes. And the normal way for Queen's Gambit players to punish dc is to play e4. Unfortunately, in this position, the d4 pawn is attacked twice, so that wouldn't work. So one idea is, of course, to take the pawn. The other idea is to put pressure on d4, which is even more important. And the third idea is to simply be able to play e5, which is now supported by the c6 knight. So by breaking the classical principles and developing the knight blocking the c-pawn, which in Queen's pawn openings is usually incorrect and either played by very good or very bad players, black has three ideas: e5, dc, and pressure on d4. And by exchanging this pawn, we are getting rid of two of those ideas. Firstly, black can never take our pawn. Secondly, after queen takes d5 and e3, we know that there will never be enough pressure on e5, as we are going to see, because white has tactical motifs here. Okay, black only has one move here, and the next three moves are going to be forced. So e5, attacking the pawn, you have to defend, knight to c3. And of course, black does not want to move the queen. If black moves the queen, as we are going to see later on, then this pawn is going to be advancing to d5, which is precisely why this variation is very appealing for white. So black develops a piece and develops a piece with tempo, because now, of course, this pawn is attacked, because the queen is not attacked anymore. So white has to react. If you take here, that's simply no good. Queen takes queen. So you unpin, reinforcing this threat. Okay, so now again, black cannot take your pawn on d4 because you take the queen. And finally, after bishop takes c3, we reach the starting position of this opening. Here, white can choose either take with the pawn, take with the bishop. They're completely different. I'm going to explain both. But once again, once we take this pawn, queen takes, e3 defending, e5 attacking d4, knight c3 attacking the queen, bishop b4 pinning, bishop d2 unpinning, and now bishop takes c3. This is a forced line, which if you play cd5 on move 3, you're going to get, because all Chigorin players will know it up to this point. Now, I'm going to be recommending the move b takes in this video, and it is the slightly more popular move. Now, both moves have been played by many strong players like Kasparov and Topalov and very strong players. So both moves are interesting. There are very important upsides to taking with the b pawn, which I'm going to show you. Before we get into b takes, I want to show you why I think bishop takes is not the ideal option. Let's see what happens. Well, in this position, if black does nothing, for example, knight f6, then you can simply take on e5 and you win a pawn. Because the queen is attacked, the queen cannot take on e5 because the bishop is defending. So black is basically forced to play queen takes queen, and after rook takes queen, you're a pawn up, and that's it. So after bishop takes, since this bishop attacks the pawn, black is forced to react. So bishop takes is more forcing than taking with the b pawn, but here are the downsides. So what black has to do is he has to take the pawn. So e takes d4. And in this position, since the pawn is still pinned, so this queen is attacked, black can never take the bishop or the pawn, white reinforces the pressure with knight e2. And this is the starting position. Of course, white is going to win his pawn back. That's not questionable. However, there are two variations which I just don't like for white. Here's the first one. Black can play three different moves. Black can play knight f6, which is the main move. Black can play bishop to g4, pinning the knight, or knight g to e7. Let's look at bishop to g4 first. This is the move I hate the most, and here is why. After bishop takes g4, of course, the knight is pinned, so this is not under as much pressure. And on the next turn, if you do nothing, black is just going to castle queenside. So, for example, a stupid move, and here, and now the queen is not attacked, and you just collapse. It's game over. So after bishop to g4, you have to play aggressively, so you play the move pawn to f3. And now, if black retreats the bishop, then white is much better, probably close to winning because of the huge space advantage. But here's the idea: bishop takes f3, pawn takes f3 and queen takes f3. And now, since you were already a pawn down, of course, the pawn on d4 is an extra pawn for black. For the moment, you have 4 pawns and you're a piece ahead, but black has 7 pawns. And of course, your rook is attacked and your bishop is attacked. So what you do is you play knight takes d4, tempo on the queen, and black takes your rook. And this is all a forced line. Knight takes c6, knight f6, you have to start developing. This is the main move, and now bishop takes f6, g takes f6, and knight to d4. And black castles. In this position, queen g4 check is a good move. The problem is if you castle queenside now, which would probably give you a better position, 2 pieces for a rook, black can take on h2, so you have to play something like knight f3, defending your pawn, and leave your king in the center. So after bishop g4, the whole line is forced. f3 takes, queen takes, knight d4, queen h1. This position you are going to get on the board. This has been played 18 times, white wins 61% of the time, but I don't like this variation because anything can happen. I believe that these pawns black has are very strong, and since the rooks have very natural open files, I think it's much easier for white to make a mistake than for black. Then again, black could get his queen trapped, black could, I don't know, blunder, but for the moment his king is safe. Of course, your king is never going to be safe, and he has 2 very good rooks. So that's bishop g4. A crazy line. The other line, knight g7, is quite boring, and here's what happens. You have to play knight takes d4, have to take your pawn back. And after knight takes d4, queen takes d4 is the best move. You can take with the bishop, but then simply castles. And after queen takes, bishop takes, and castles, this is very dry. You have the 2 bishops, but I don't think it should be enough to win because of black's queenside pawn majority, and he has very active plans. I mean, here you probably play bishop c4 simply to prevent bishop e6. But still, these pawns are going to get moving quite quickly. And I think black has enough. In short, white should not be winning this if 2 good players are playing, unless somebody makes a bad mistake. And what's considered to be the best move for black is neither bishop g4 nor knight e7, it's knight f6. And now again, you have to take your pawn. And again, here's what happens. Knight takes d4. In this position, black's main move is not to exchange, although he could exchange and get into the same position again just with the knight on f6, but simply castles kingside. And here, since black queen is undefended, white has several options, but the best one is knight b5. Black should probably decline the queen trade and plays queen g5. So, and if you don't want to play knight b5, then you can take on c6, and after queen takes c6, you can play something like rook to c1. And again, your king is still in the center. You're 2 moves away from castling. You can play stuff like bishop d4, but queen d6, and I don't think it's such a big deal. I don't think your bishop pair is enough to win. Again, the queens are on the board, which sometimes mean this majority is more significant, sometimes it means it's less significant, but still, black shouldn't be worse here. Which, if you play against the Chigorin, that's not normal. Black has to be worse, because he played knight c6. At least in theory, he should be worse. Okay, but knight b5 is the way to try and punish that. However, after queen g5, black gets exactly what he wants. Now it's not easy to castle, and maybe rook d8 is coming. So white again has to justify his play and plays h4, queen h6, and now knight takes e7. You grab a pawn, but after bishop g4, this gets very tricky. Queen b3, rook a d8, queen takes pawn on b7, rook d6. I mean, again, your material up, and you have the bishop pair, and everything seems perfect, but your king is in the center. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces that could potentially attack your king in 1 or 2 moves, which means a high probability to blunder. This has been played 3 times, and the highest rated game is Luke Van Wiele versus Brynel Stellan. Of course, Luke Van Wiele is 200 points high rated, so he won that game. But it's possible to blunder here. So my point is, in this position, if you take with the bishop, black has three options, all of which either lead to very boring or two interesting positions. So if you feel like gambling, or if you feel like learning 20 moves of engine lines, after which you are simply better, then go ahead. There are lines you will be able to find. But here's the human move. After bishop takes c3, not bishop takes, but b takes. And this is a very human way to play, and there are human advantages after this move. And I find these positions much simpler to play. Now here's the point. Once you take with the b pawn, you get a new c pawn. Of course, you exchanged on d5. And the main idea is you want to go c4, d5. And with that space gain, you are going to have two problems in this position. And before I show you any theory here, I want to talk about two things. The first thing is what white should do. White should either try to play c4, d5 or f3, e4, d5. In either case, black has to break that center up. If there's a pawn on e4, f5 is your break. If there's a pawn on d5, c6 is your break. If there is a structure with c4, d5, e4, f3, f5 and c6 are your breaks. However, even if f5 happens, and this should be an improved f5 considering normal King's Indian positions because there's no bad g7 bishop, even if f5 does happen, white doesn't have to react. Because if there's a pawn on e4, there's a pawn on f3. After f5, if black takes, you simply reinforce your center. And if black plays f4, then you're perfectly fine. You've already established this great pawn chain, so there's no quick attack. So let's see what happens. Black has several options. Let's go through the rare bad moves first. Knight g7 simply runs into c4, and after queen d6 runs into d5. Usually this happening should not be bad, but this knight really wants to go to e7 in most variations. It's not that going to b8 is too bad, because you have knight b8, knight d7, knight c5, sort of Bogo Indian ideas. So that should be okay. However, knight e7 is better. So after knight b8, white should have a pleasant advantage. Okay, the second option I want to look at is, what if black simply exchanges? Well, after e takes d4 and c takes d4, you can immediately see white's advantage. White has two central pawns, black has 0. White is immediately better. However, this is a dynamic advantage in a sense that if central control is not important, if there are no pieces on the board, then this is just a weakness and black can create a passed pawn. So this is better for white for as long as there are minor pieces on the board and plenty of them, because black's pieces are going to be restricted. So for example, something like knight f6 and knight f3 and castles and bishop e2 and bishop f5. Again, black's pieces do not have as many squares as white's pieces, and this should be more pleasant. So this is considered to be bad for black, but it's not too clear, because if black manages to trade, then he is fine. Okay, and the two main moves are queen d6 and knight f6. Queen d6 simply preempts c4 and e4. So white doesn't play c4 because, of course, pawn takes d5. In the other lines, after, for example, knight f6, you can afford c4 because the queen is attacked, so you cannot take the pawn. So, okay. Queen d6, white cannot play c4, but he plays bishop to d3, a very normal developing move. And if these pawns are invited forward, which happens after knight f6, then it's easier to break them with c6 and f5. If they remain on their original squares, then it's very hard to break this up. Imagine this being a Grunfeld. You don't have a bishop on g7, you're never going to break this. So even if the pawns stay where they are, you still have the bishop pair, and you have a great central structure. Okay, knight g7, knight e2, black castles, white castles. And now I think b6 is the best way to play to prepare c5. So for example, f3, bishop e6, bishop e1 maybe, and playing for bishop f2. rook a to d8, queen to c2, you're going to play bishop f2, but once black gets in c5, he breaks up something. It's, again, you could play this if the knight moves away and gain some more space, but c6 is going to come and f5 is going to come. So don't be too tempted with these pawn pushes. You could end up blundering. But looking at a position like this, you have to love white. I mean, white has the bishop pair. Both bishops are very good. White has a great center. White has active plans, and black only has these two plans, c5 and breaking on d4. In the meantime, white can do a lot of things. Okay, and most people are going to play knight f6. So this is what we should be focusing on. This is the main move which you probably will get in most of your games. So after knight f6, you have two options. You can play c4, d5, but that's slightly risky. Here is why. After c4, queen d6, of course, and d5 and knight e7, as we said. What you want to do now is play e4. So most people play queen b1 in this position. But after castles and e4, it actually becomes much easier for black to break this and to occupy some very nice squares. So this is already slightly weird. f5, castles, f4, f3. This is what I was talking about after f5, f4. You're not getting mated, but still, this knight is a monster. Black can start g5, a normal pawn storm, and these bishops are just bad. There's almost no potential for these bishops to be good. In fact, the best thing you can do is to give up your good bishop for this knight on c5, and then you're left with this idiot here. So most people play queen b1. Queen a4 is interesting, and after bishop d7 you play queen c2 with the same idea of e4. However, black can now exchange cd, cd, and immediately play rook c8. Here you have a passed pawn on d5, which is great. But again, this is going to be undermined, and as soon as f5 happens, you probably lose d5, and your king is still in the center. So, not a big fan of that. The engine actually plays knight f3, which seems counterintuitive because it allows knight e4 and e4. But now queen c2 and bishop f5 and bishop to d3. This is an engine line. This has never been played. Knight takes and bishop takes and queen takes. And the engine seems to think white is slightly better. I can understand why this is better than the other lines. There are no bad bishops. But I don't think this is enough because, again, black can break the position open. So after knight f6, even though c4 seems extremely tempting, I think there's a much better way to play, and of course the main way to play, according to theory, is pawn to f3, where you simply don't overextend yet. And if black plays e4, which is not the best move, but let's just see what happens. After e4, since there's no pressure on this pawn, you can now advance, and after queen d6 you can now play queen to b1. And if the pawn was here, you would have to advance to d5. Since the pawn is on e4, you don't have to advance. You would love black to take on f3 because then you develop your knight. Or if you're feeling, well, adventurous, you could take with the pawn. But bishop f5 is probably the sensible move, and now simply f4. And this has been played by Jan Gustafsson, I think. Yeah, he drew the game. I looked at that game. One of my favorite theoreticians, Boris Avruk, won a game from this position. So once this happens, now your center is kind of safe, because if ever c5, then d5, and it's a bit more solid. So against f3, e4 is really not something black should be considering. So black should just castle. And now the difference is, you play e4, the queen again goes to d6, you play d5, and the knight again goes to e7, and you play c4. The difference is you've already played both f3 and e4, meaning that f5 breaks are prevented, because takes, f takes, and f4 castles and the normal position. And your center is a bit more secure. Of course, on any c takes d5, you take with the c pawn, and you should be okay. Knight d7, again, looking at the c5 square, is the best idea. Knight e2, knight c5, and now knight c3. And sometimes knight c3 is interesting for knight a4, which I believe is a very good idea. Sometimes this knight jumps into b5, and I've actually analyzed some positions with knight b5 which are very hard to play. So if black makes a mistake and doesn't play c6 straight away, then knight b5. So c6, you simply continue developing. There's too much defense on d5. So black has to break it with b5. And this is sort of the point at which you have to start studying yourself. I believe that this position is extremely good for white. I would enjoy playing it for white. If black doesn't play b6, then maybe knight g6 is playable for knight f4. Maybe simply bishop d7. Maybe b6 for either bishop a6 or simply defending the knight. Maybe f5 straight away, and after castles f4 and start an attack. So I like white here. I like white. And if you can get rid of this guy, which is going to be hard, but if black ever breaks on d5, then it's not going to be too hard because you're going to be able to play bishop b5. So there are several ideas. After b5, for example, which I think is the best move, you simply take cd, and after cd, c takes d5. And after c takes d5, you play knight takes d5. And after bishop e6, it seems that you're collapsing, but you can play knight e7, and after queen e7, you can castle. Now this is a different story. Now you have the bishop pair in a very open position, and something like queen e1 and bishop e3, and this seems very scary for black. Especially because this bishop doesn't really have that much influence in the game. So once again, against the Chigorin, this exchange is extremely fun for white to play. You play e3, black attacks, you play knight c3, black pins, you unpin, black takes, and my suggestion is to take with the b pawn, because you have all of these ideas, extending your center, taking up a ton of space, and then once black attempts to break it, your bishop pair, which is your original advantage, becomes important. I hope you liked the video, hope you got something from this. This is what I play against the Chigorin when I played the Queen's Gambit, and it's a fun opening. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to finish the Chigorin series with the main line, and we're going to be looking at the move knight c3 for white, which is incredibly dangerous for both sides. And basically by playing the Chigorin, black is risking getting into this position in which his main idea is quick development, rapid development, attacking play, aggressive placement of the pieces, pins all over the board, and hoping that white goes wrong. Now, it's highly likely that white is going to go wrong. However, if he doesn't, black's play is not at all justified, and black is going to have a hard time navigating the positions. That being said, it's much easier for white to blunder in practical play, so the scores sort of even out even on the highest levels. And the engine, of course, prefers white with correct play, but nevertheless, it's a solid opening for black. So we're looking at the main line, knight c3. The idea behind knight c3 is, of course, black is unable to support his center with the c-pawn, therefore let's attack the center, and white has, of course, created a threat, just knight takes pawn on d5. So black has several options. I'm going to mention a few sidelines quickly. We're going to have a look at e6, we're going to have a look at e5, the Tartakower gambit, and we're going to have a look at knight f6, but we will focus heavily on dc4, which is the principal move. And basically by playing the Chigorin, black is trying to do two things. Firstly, put pressure on the pawn on d4, so dc makes a lot of sense, putting pressure on d4 straight away. Also trying to play the move e5, which is supported by the knight. And if we play dc4 and white simply does nothing, for example plays pawn to e4, which is a move we would like to play in normal queen's pawn openings, then of course we can just take on d4 with the queen and we are better. So by playing knight c3, white has chosen not to defend the pawn on d4, making dc a powerful threat. So white has several options after dc4, and we're going to have a look at all of them. White can play knight f3, white can play d5, or white can play e3, all doing something to defend d4. But before we get into that, let's go through the sidelines quickly. First of all, let's have a look at e6. After knight c3, e6 is the most passive move, and this basically defends the pawn on d5, keeps this bishop locked in. As we are going to see, we really want this bishop on g4, and usually in the mainline Chigorin we want to have our bishop on g4, the other bishop on b4, knights on c6, f6, tremendous pressure on the center, and just trying to blast white off the board. So having said that, e6 doesn't seem like a logical move in this position. It's not a bad move, it's just not the most active. White should continue with knight f3, and now black has the option to play bishop b4, but this move bishop b4 isn't as effective in this position because there's no knight on f6, there's no pawn on e4, as we're going to see in other positions when black is threatening either knight takes e4 or knight e4. That's far more effective. So knight f6 is the better choice. And white continues bishop g5, pinning the knight. We unpin with bishop e7. White plays pawn to e3. And now what we have is a normal position, except that the knight is on c6, which can be good, can be bad. I'm not a fan of blocking my c-pawn. I've been playing the semi-Slav for a long time, so I like to have my d5 pawn protected. But it's not a huge deficit. Okay, black castles. White plays rook c1, we play h6. It is possible to take on f6, but usually you can take on f6 when the bishop is either still on f8 or on b4. So in this position, bishop h4 is more logical. Now knight e4 leads to an exchange, and white should always be slightly better. Let's say knight e7, let's say bishop to d3. You can, of course, take on e4, but that's unnecessary. Takes. And now the knight has moved. Black has the option to support his center. He can also take on c4, and after bishop c4, continue with b6, bishop b7, c5, or even c6 and e5. And black is going to have a very hard time equalizing. So the move e6 is not something I would recommend. Now let's look at e5. e5, the Tartakower gambit, is simply not good if white knows what he is doing. So this is not popular on the highest level. There's a game, Ben Feingold actually plays this, and that's why I've spent most of my time studying this move from his games. Unfortunately, if you look at his games, he loses most of them when he plays good players. There's his game against Alexei Drev, which he lost, and there's also a game against Gabriel Sargsyan, which he lost. So the basic idea of the move e5 is I want to blast through the center straight away, regardless of what happens afterwards. And white should simply take on d5 and be better. I'm going to show you two moves that give black an advantage, so white should avoid them. The first move is d5, and this is simply better for black after d4. You now have to play something like knight d5, knight g7, threatening to win a pawn, e4 defending the knight, but now en passant, bishop takes, and knight d5, pawn d5, knight e5, and white is left with an isolated queen's pawn, which is not on d4, it's on d5. It lacks protection, and this knight is actually good. Black can, of course, also develop with tempo, but be careful about queen a4. So this is not good. Also, knight takes d5 is bad because of knight takes d4, and again, black should have a slight edge after e3 and knight e6, and for example knight f3 c6, where you get to either trade the queens or misplace the knight, so queen d1, knight d1, and bishop d6 or f6 are both good, and black should have a slight edge in this position with a small actually opening advantage because he has a lead in development. As you can see, black has two pieces developed, it's white to move, so it's as if the colors were reversed. But cd5, which is the main move, in my opinion, almost refutes the Tartakower gambit, and black should really have nothing after cd5. So cd5, the idea is knight d4. You don't gambit the pawn, you get your pawn back, but you go for this trade which attempts to complicate the position. However, after the move e3 and knight f5, there's really nothing in this position. Bishop d6, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, you have to trade pieces. c6 of course doesn't work, so bishop takes, queen takes, and now e4, misplacing the knight once again. The knight goes back to e7, and after white castles you're forced to play the move h6 to prevent bishop g5. If you try to play knight f6 and castle, then bishop g5 comes, and you either have to move the knight again, which loses a pawn, for example knight h5, knight e5, or you have to give up castling rights. So after castles, you play h6, losing another move, and after something like queen b3, you have to play b6, losing another move. And white has more space, white has very active pieces. Your bishop on d6, which is the normal Chigorin bishop in these positions, doesn't really do much. You are 2 moves away from castling, and I understand why the engine prefers white in this position. So I know that strong players play e5. Ben Feingold is of course a very strong grandmaster, but you are risking a lot. If white knows what he is doing, you're going to be worse. Another move I would like to mention is, instead of the main line of course, is knight f6. And now this move can transpose to the main line easily. If white plays knight f3, which is the main move, you have the option to play cd5 and you are in the main line. We are going to have a look at that. However, white doesn't have to play knight f3, white can play cd5. And with this move, white is committing himself a lot, which makes knight f6 an interesting option for black on move 3. Let's look at what happens. You take on d5, and now white has 2 options, knight f3, which is less committal, and e4, which is very committal. e4 is the justification of this line. So e4, knight c3, bc3, the sort of Grunfeld center for white. The difference is you don't have c5, you don't have a bishop on g7, so you have to break the center with e5. And e5 makes a ton of sense because it forces white to commit further. Of course, de would be just crushing for black. Queen d1, king d1, knight e5, and black is better. So white has to play d5. And now we reroute the knight to b8, and we play a Bogo Indian idea of knight d7, knight c5. There's this great square on c5 because the pawn has moved. And I actually like this for black because it's extremely committal for white. For example, bishop e2, castles, castles, knight d7, let's say bishop e3, and knight c5, queen e7, knight c5. And you're playing a Bogo Indian with a king's Indian center, sort of, without a stupid bishop on g7. You have great control over c5. It's very hard for white to organize counterplay on the queen side, and this is a pleasant position. So after knight d5, e4 has to be played with great care. Knight f3 is solid, more solid. Here you have a choice to play e5 or bishop g4. e5 I think is the principled move, and after d5 you play bishop b4 and get your Chigorin play in. You have temporarily sacrificed the pawn. Well, maybe you're not even going to get it back if you choose not to, and you have great play, which is the point of this variation. Bishop d2, knight c3, bc3, bishop a5. You can see that all of your pieces are extremely active. Queen e7, bishop g2. As I said, you can take the pawn, but you don't have to. Castles, queen a4, bishop b6. Again, you can take the pawn at some point, but you don't have to. And this is pleasant. Black's pawn structure is perfect. The only thing standing in the way of complete harmony is the knight on c6, because you really would like to, well, in this position, probably have the knight on d7 and the bishop on c6, or the pawn on c6, the bishop on f5. But yeah, this is pleasant. This is pleasant for black. So knight f6 seems like a very interesting option. And of course, white can choose to play knight f3 and instead of cd5. So what do you do if knight f3? Well, as we said, you can transpose to the main line with dc, but you don't have to. If you don't want to transpose to the main line, you can play two different moves. You can play bishop g4, or you can play e6. e6 leads to the passive position after e6 on move 3, as we saw. So bishop g4 seems interesting. And now again, since you haven't taken on c4, white should really take on d5. And after knight d5, e4, we get the same Grunfeld center. And again, we get to play e5, and again d5, and again this idea. So we get a pretty similar position. So knight f6 seems very interesting. After knight f6, your idea is not to take on c4. Your idea is to have a bishop on g4 and to play an early e5, and to be able to play, if white takes on d5, which you should, to play knight d5, and then you take on c3. So this is very interesting. Okay, now let's finally head over to the main line. This is why black plays the Chigorin, and this is how black tries to punish knight c3. So this is going to be our focus for this video. So we are trying to put immediate pressure on d4. We take on c4. Fine, d takes c4. Now, what can white do? White has three options, basically. We are going to be focusing on the move knight f3, which happens pretty much every time. e3 is an option I would like to mention briefly, which is quite passive, and it should be met with e5 and d5 knight c7, where after bishop c4 and knight g6, black has absolutely no issues in this position. e4 is going to happen, but that will give up the f4 square, and you are going to play knight f6, bishop d6, and the pleasant position. So e3 is kind of passive. An interesting option, though, is the very early d5, and this we have to study somewhat if we are going to play the Chigorin, because it can be scary. Of course, you have the option to play knight e5 in this position, and since there's no pawn on d4, so you should play knight e5. And white has three different moves here. All three, I think, if black plays correctly, give black a very pleasant position. The point is, all three moves try to dislodge the knight. Queen d4 is the most straightforward way, attacking the pawn as well. f4 is the most aggressive and the most weakening, and bishop f4 is seemingly most sensible, but actually worst of all three. So let's look at f4 first. After f4, we are playing a sort of pawn attack in the Alekhine, and after knight d7, we continue e4. However, after knight b6, it's very likely that unless white commits some more, black is going to keep his extra pawn. Remember, black is a pawn up. So white has to continue playing crazy. So a4, trying to win the c4 pawn. a5, and now bishop e3. Forced to give up his bishop pair to be able to recapture his pawn, and black is happy about that. e6, bishop takes, bishop takes pawn, bishop b4 pins the knight, d bishop e. You can take on e6, you can take the queen first, let's say like this. And in this position, white doesn't really have an opening advantage. It's a 3-on-2 on the queen side for black and 4-on-3 on the king side for white. It should be perfectly equal. For example, knight e2, knight f6, and already threatening to win a pawn. So I don't think black has any issues here. So the move d5 and e5 after f4 actually leads to a risky position for white, in which he has to commit and give up his bishop to win his pawn back, and he doesn't have an advantage if black knows what he's doing. Queen d4, I think, is even slightly worse. We just play knight g6 again, queen takes c4, and now we play a6. The idea of a6 is to prevent queen a4, knight b5, and all that stuff, and to play b5 and bishop b7. So queen b3. We continue knight f6, which is normal, knight f3, and now b5. And once this bishop gets to b7, this seems like a perfectly harmonious position. The only problem we have is developing this guy on f8, but eventually we are going to be able to play either e5 or e6. So for example, e4 happens, we can now play e5. And if that's taken en passant, we take with the bishop. So no problems there. Again, our bishop is going to go to d6, and we have the f4 square. It's a very nice position. So queen d4 I don't think is a good move. And also bishop f4. Again, we play knight g6, bishop g3, sort of Caro-Kann idea, and immediately e5, which is the point of this. And after e4, we again play bishop d6. He takes his pawn back fine, but again, we have this idea of a6 and b5 and bishop to b7. So after dc4, the main line, d5 is interesting, but it shouldn't lead to an advantage for white. So we really should be focusing on the move knight f3. e3, as we said, is too passive because you want to play e4, and you have to defend your pawn, so knight f3 is the only move. Okay, now black plays knight f6, and in this position, there are 4 moves we have to study. One we just have to mention briefly, and that's e3. That's really of no concern because we strike out with e5 straight away. So we are going to be looking at bishop g5, bishop g5. We are going to be looking at d5, which is very interesting. And finally, we will have a look at e4, which is the main line. Now, d5 is the old move, and d5 is the critical move. This used to be played all the time. Recently, it got a bad reputation because it's very tricky, and black can basically hold on to the pawn or force white to go into a mental position in which black is just better, practically. The reason why d5 very early on is not good is because we have knight a5. And the only way to try and punish knight a5 is queen a4. Unfortunately for white, we have this move c6, and after c6, we are defending the knight, our pawn is defended, so you just don't have anything here. We are threatening b5, of course, defending and dislodging the queen. If you trade, then, well, you just lost your entire center. So there's one way to play this position for white, which leads to crazy positions better for black, and that's b4. Of course, we don't want to take en passant. We want to gain a tempo on the queen. So the line goes b5, and of course, this seems to be just losing the knight. In reality, it's much better for black, because after queen a5, ba5, we now play b4. And if the knight moves, for example, knight d1, then dc, and these pawns are just very strong. They are much stronger than one piece. You are only 2 pawns up for the piece, but you have a passed pawn on c4. And in combination with bishop a6 and bishop c5 and rook c8 and castles short and rook d8 or rook b8, rook c8, it's going to be very hard to stop those pawns. So after b4, most people actually play dc6, which allows you to play bc3, and I mean, black's fine here. All of these are weak, and it's going to take both sides time to recapture those pawns, and it should be slightly better for black. So the early d5 is really no good. And after knight a5, if you want to play something else, if you want to play e4, for example, then we just continue c6, and again, a pleasant position, striking at the center. You, of course, don't have e5. So bishop g5, for example, and black basically holds on to the pawn. You can now play cd5, and after ed5, you can now play e6. You still have your extra pawn. So, for example, bishop f6, gf6. If white, for example, takes on c4, then knight c4 and queen a4 check, and bishop d7, queen takes c4. Black has given the pawn back, but he has the bishop pair, and he has the rook on c8, and he has a lot of attacking prospects. So the early d5, I really don't think is a good move. And recently, as I said, it's scored pretty bad. So yeah, let's have a look at bishop g5. After bishop g5, very early on, before e6 or e5 have been played, white is trying to disrupt black's position. And black really has nothing better but to play h6 and try to force this bishop to commit. It's possible to play bishop h4, it's possible to take. Taking, I believe, is critical. If bishop h4 is played, Then you can play a6, preparing b5, and if white is not careful, you're going to keep your pawn. So d5 in this position. Now you play knight a5, e4, and in this position you can play b5, you can play c6, you can play g5. I think g5 is the best move, and after bishop g3 you simply play bishop to g7. And still, after queen a4, c6, white has to waste time and his bishop pair regaining this pawn. So black shouldn't be in any trouble. However, this position is messy, which is why I don't really like the move don't like to face the move bishop g5. But yeah, still, it's something you have to do as black if you play this line. The other option is to take on f6, and after e takes f6, white continues e3 and picks up the pawn cleanly, bishop d6, bishop c4, and castles. And this should be a very calm position in which black has the bishop pair for not that much. Fine, white has the center, but this bishop pair is very strong, looking at the king. Okay, and now finally, let's look at the main line, and that's e4. After e4, black now has to play very actively, and this is what the Chigorin is about. We play bishop g4. Now, there's an immediate threat. You're threatening to play bishop takes f3, and knight takes d4, or queen takes d4. So, white is already forced to defend. He plays bishop e3. Fine, we play e6. White gets his pawn back. Okay, material is equal. And we now play bishop b4. And again, there's a threat. Now we are threatening bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes e4. So we are creating a threat after a threat after a threat. And there are two moves in this position. Queen c2, which is the old move, and queen d3, which is the modern move. Against queen d3, I'm going to show you a nice trick you can try to play, which most of the time is going to succeed, I think. So let's have a look at queen d3 first. Still, queen c2 is more popular, but queen d3 is the move on the highest levels. Fine. Here the main move is to castle, which is of course okay. And you can castle, knight d2, e5. Let me show you that. Castles. Knight d2, e5, d5, knight e7. This is a normal position. And after bishop d7, white is trying to play a kingside attack, but it's going to cost him security. And yeah, castles lead to positions like this. The move I would recommend is bishop h5. And now you're setting a trap. So in this position, you are threatening bishop to g6. And if white does nothing, then you just take on c3 and play bishop g6. I'm going to show you why this works. What white should do in this position is castle, and I'm going to show you why. If white, for example, plays a3, now white is immediately losing material. So bishop c3, bc3, and bishop g6. And it seems like there are two ways to defend this pawn, either knight d2 or bishop g5. However, they both lose material. If knight d2 is played, then there's this nice trick, knight e4. And after knight e4, you play queen h4. Of course, you would like to play f3, defending your knight, but you can't because your king is still on e1. Therefore, you're going to lose this knight regardless of what you do. And black is a clean pawn up. If after bishop g6, bishop g5 is played, then you can simply play bishop e4, attacking the queen. And if queen e4, for example, then knight e4 just wins a pawn. So again, just a pawn up. The best move is queen e2, but now you can just play bishop d5, and again, you're a clean pawn up. So, after bishop h5, white cannot play any move. White has to castle. And in this position, if you try the same thing, bishop c3, bc3, bishop g6, now knight d2 actually works, because if you play knight e4, queen h4, then f3, you just lost a piece. So against queen d3, I would recommend this move bishop h5. Even if white does castle, you're not worse. You can just continue with castling. You can also play other normal moves, so you're not worse. And you can just castle. And in this position, if a3 is played, you can play bishop a5 and read out the bishop, and not all is lost. Of course, both of these moves are very committal, and white will have a hard time playing any of them. So that's queen d3. If queen c2 is played, which is the normal way to play, of course, no tricks with bishop g6 because white always has bishop d3, then we continue normally. We just castle. White plays rook d1, we play queen e7, bishop to e2 unpinning, and now e5. You have to break the center. White is always going to play d5 against e5. And in this position, we have reached the critical position of the Chigorin, in which, unless you know it, you're not going to play the correct move. It's possible to play knight b8 here and play for c5, but with the pawn still on b2, that's just not as effective. So you have to play knight d4. And we have knight d4, e d4, rook d4, and as you can see, black has now given up a pawn. However, after bishop e2, king e2, and knight g4, you should have slight compensation here for the pawn. I don't like this for black, I'll be honest, because I think white can always hold on. The main move here is knight d1, and after something like bishop c5, rook c4, knight e3, bishop e3, king e3, despite white's unsafe king, white should be okay. I don't think there's that much pressure on the position. And of course there's pressure on c7. If you ever take on g2, there might be pressure on g7. I'll turn on the engine just to tell you the evaluation. The engine says it's plus 0.8 for white after c6. Now it says it's plus 1. So that means it's playable for black. And if this is what black gets after white's best play, then it's playable. So yeah, the mainline Chigorin is a very interesting opening. I've changed my mind several times over the course of this series as I was studying games. If I'm white, I would actually play the mainline now. I wouldn't play the exchange. So yeah, I realize that I've changed my mind several times. I believe this is the critical variation for a reason. Good luck with both colors. I hope this video helps at least a bit. Let me know what you think in the comments and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.